Welcome to Read This Author's Corner. I am your host, Alice James, and today we will be speaking with author and educator, Dr. Bettina Judd. Bettina is the author of two books. One is Patient, and the other is Feelin. Welcome, Bettina. So great to have you. I can't wait to get into this conversation about feelings. But before, can you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and then we'll jump straight into the book?
Sure. My name is Bettina Judd. I am an interdisciplinary scholar, writer, artist, and Feelin is my second book. My first was a collection of poetry titled Patient, and it was on the legacy of medical experimentation on Black women. Feelin is a discussion of the creative practices that Black women artists engage, and how that is knowledge production, particularly Black feminist knowledge production. And I talk about it through this idea of feeling because I understand feeling, and that is the interrupted gerund version, like the Black
Right.
English version of the G, right? Um, as a cultural way of describing a particular way of knowing that is wholly embodied, as in I'm feeling that.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I am also faculty at the University of Washington in Seattle in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies.
The title, can you break down the title for us? Can you give us a little insight about where she came from?
Right. So yeah, feeling like I said to describe these kind of deep down ways of knowing, these affective ways of knowing, creative practice, pleasure, and Black feminist thought. I'm looking at specifically creative practice as the place where feeling is developed. This work. For instance, as an example of this desire to think with artwork through the idea of it being something the artist needed to create, and that being a kind of well of knowledge, through this notion of feeling, is I begin the book by talking about two artists, these two photographs, of two different artists, but one of them that I'll focus on for this description is Medeva Warwick Fuller. Medeva Warwick Fuller was a sculptor, who was active in the early 20th century. She's very close to W.B. Du Bois and the idea of the talented tenth, and so her statues kind of reflected that. Probably one of her most famous statues is titled Ethiopia Awakens.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's a kind of Egyptian style, royalty looking to the east,
Mhm.
right? And so, those are the types of statues that she creates. And of course, she's a part of a movement for racial uplift. She precedes the the Harlem Renaissance, but she's kind of a mother of it in some ways. And in 1918, she sculpted a a sketch, right? It was it's about 12 inches in height, it's about a foot in height, and it's made out of plaster. And she painted it for to note where things might be in bronze. You get the sense in the way that it is made that it could be a monument of some kind. It sits on a pedestal that she creates, and it is a tribute to Mary Turner, and it as a silent protest against mob violence. If we remember Mary Turner, she was a woman in Valdosta, Georgia, who in 1918 was brutally lynched. She was pregnant. They also attacked the unborn fetus in her body, and she was brutally lynched for protesting the unjust lynching of her husband the day before. Um, and so she kept this statue of Mary Turner in her studio. And in some writings, acknowledges that she felt that the statue was too incendiary for public viewing, right? And so thinking about, the politics of what it means that a commemoration of this brutal lynching would be too incendiary for public viewing in an era where there was a lot of artistic protest art against lynching, but so much of it did not include the lynching of women, and definitely not the lynching of a pregnant woman, right? So the fact that she thought of it from her New England studio, right? Like, she's not in the South. She thought of it as too incendiary, I think tells us something about racial attitudes toward Black motherhood, toward Black womanhood, and how um, public discussions of the kinds of violence that Black women, Black mothers could endure, how those were rare or silenced, or could never happen, and would shed light on the particular ways that this idea, that kind of idealization of a precious motherhood or precious womanhood, is not afforded to
To Black
Black women.
Wow, that which is very true, it, and I think that's one of the things that I really like and enjoy about your writing is how you weave so much of history into what you're saying now, and taking the understanding of history and molding it with current events, current experience. And then when you're able to turn that into poetry, it's like how did she put that together? That's what I feel. Creative practices, and I truly understand what you mean when you talk about creating something. Um, my background is art and design, and I've had like the 40-year career in the fashion industry, and art, sketching, sewing, cooking. I tell people I like all things creative. I anything I can put my own spin on makes me happy. That's my zen place. Um,
Mhm,
so I see creative practices and I'm all in. You're like, I'm all ears. You got both of my ears open. So can
mhm.
you just elaborate on how the book kind of like embraces those creative practices?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that I too, think of myself first as an artist. And so, the central argument of the book is that creative practice is knowledge production, right? It is a way of making, as Audre Lorde says, like, things that might not be they're not new knowledge, but new ways of making them felt.
Mhm.
Um, and so the book itself actually incorporates and is very much based on my own creative practice as I am researching, as I am making sense of other Black women artists, and making sense of, you know, topics and subject matter that I am interested as an artist. So, for instance, the first chapter of the book is a series of poems um, that is also a film, and people can navigate to the film via a QR code that is shown at the beginning of that chapter. And the and so the chapter itself is on grief. It's a Black study of grief. And the poems are the kind of substance of the chapter, in that they are a way that I processed my own grief. Um, and it demonstrates the ways that Black studies, Black feminist studies, has helped me and then sometimes compounded, right, the ways of grief that I was experiencing. So it's a series of 17 plus one poems. And I began to pen them in the summer of 2018, which is the summer that my father passed away. And, I thought, of course, at that point that this was maybe winding down at that point, 2-year kind of stretch of just many losses in my family. He was like the 11th in a 2-year period at that time. Since that number has grown. Um, but the kind of inability to completely mourn one close family member, um, and those deaths coming one after another was a lot. And I myself couldn't really properly process. But something happened kind of in a very local news to Seattle, but it ended up kind of also being international news. That same summer, a mother orca gave birth to, her name was Tahlequah, or J35. And she's a part of the J pod of southern resident orcas that are in the kind of area around just north of Seattle. She gave birth to a calf, and that calf pretty much immediately died after its birth. But she carried the dead baby calf on her back for 17 days. And it was like really a local outpouring of, people mourning for her and with her. And there, even in the Seattle Times, there were people submitted poetry dedicated to her. And um I was really interested in not only like the kind of mourning process that this whale was undergoing, the idea of carrying the dead. And she, of course, her pod is very much endangered and are in constant looking for food, and she wasn't eating. Right, she was doing that morning thing where you just stop, kind of, you do some self neglect. And anytime the baby calf would fall off of her back, she would dive down and get it and lift it back up, right? There were also, as the scientists at Friday Harbor observed, these kind of events with other whales that looked like rituals. She was at one point surrounded by female orcas around kind of sunset, right? And so, like, what was happening for those whales at that time? And so I thought about the idea of there being a public dedication to this, an interspecies public dedication to this, mother whale, but also in a period of time where there are human mothers also, like, as opposed to this black fish, black human mothers mourning the deaths of their children by the hands of police. Um, that I was also thinking about what it meant to carry your dead with you wherever you went. Um, and what it means to finally let go. Like, what was that moment for her, right? And so that's what this series of poems, like, works through. I was thinking with Black studies because it already had the information,
Right.
and it began to make me think of Black studies itself as a study of grief. So that if you
Mm,
look at those kinds of early works, for instance, by W.E.B. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk, the sorrow songs, the dedications to the child that he lost, right? Um, that there is within Black studies a very heightened awareness of death and the inability to mourn what is gone because something has already
something
happened
new is
again.
happening. Right. Very true. Very true. This morning, or
Like,
or to prevent the next morning, the next thing tomorrow.
Yeah.
I love that story. And I love how you've, sorry, connected it back to the whole experience of being Black and that empathy and the prayerfulness, that the same empathy that would be afforded a whale or interspecies animal would be afforded another human being, which often doesn't happen. I didn't make a note of who said this in their description of your book. They were talking about, we talked about grief, but it said it explored grief, anger, and ecstasy. And I thought that was an interesting trio of words. And I wanted to get your take on why those three words would be used to describe your book.
Right. So, chapter one is a study of grief. And it is anger and
Sorry.
ecstasy. Yes, anger and ecstasy are other chapters. There's also a chapter on joy and a chapter on shame. That's why I was like thinking which one. Ecstasy is a chapter that I wrote about vocal practice, Black women's vocal practice. It's chapter 3 of the book. And it is about the vocal practices of Black women artists that do this intentional work of bringing about ecstasy, bringing about ecstatic joy, and that there within Black culture, there is not a differentiation between the sacred and the secular, between the sacred music and secular, i.e., sexual music, right?
Mm.
And so I start that chapter with the Queen, Aretha Franklin,
Franklin?
because I think, yes, I think she absolutely embodies this the most, right? Like she is, the greatest gospel album, the greatest selling gospel album of all time is by
Mm-hmm.
her, a secularist.
Right.
Right, right. And so, but she was also very, very into like and expressive in terms of the erotic aspect of her music, right? So I specifically look at um the album Live at the Fillmore, right?
Mhm.
Aretha Franklin Live, and that's at the Fillmore West in San Francisco. And it's, 3 nights of amazing performance. And I'm looking specifically at this moment where the songs Spirit of the in the Dark and Dr. Feelgood
Mm.
are performed. And in the album, they're performed kind of in a different order than the live presentation, but I think those that the kind of juxtaposition that happens on the album is a perfect edit, right?
Mhm.
And so one thing is that listening to Dr. Feelgood, I mean, we know what Dr. Feelgood is about. You
Right.
can kind of get what Dr. Feelgood is about from the title, but there is what we would call in the church a praise break at the
Mm.
end of that song.
Mhm.
Right. And it is
Mhm.
a for real praise break. There are points. There's one night where she gets so wrapped up in the spirit that she starts to kind of sing, talk,
Mhm.
testify. Right.
Mhm.
And she starts talking about how um not only like this man that makes you feel so good, but this is also in 1971. So that
Right.
we're still kind of at the height of movement building that's happening. And you start to hear her actually start to preach in a
Mm.
way. And so she goes from this kind of clearly sexual thing to something that is totally spiritual. And then you realize you've been in the spiritual realm the whole time,
Okay.
right? Like,
You have a very unique, um, interesting, and powerful way of combining history and melding flavors. If you were a chef, I just can imagine the flavors that you would put together if you were creating food instead of poetry and literature. It would just be dynamic because your writing is dynamic.
Thank you.
You,
Thank you.
you are an amazing chef of words. Your combinations are.
Receive that. I receive that.
Before we run out of time, I do want to touch back on patience because I found patience and it just spoke to me. It spoke to me again because of your ability to put these flavors together that you're just like, she put history, she put her personal experience, she gave these women validated these women that, were kind of cast aside. She did all of that in a poem. Daggone girl, you bad. When I saw that, and that is a history that people don't talk about. Marion Sims on a pedestal keeps it from being
Literally a
spoken about,
pedestal.
keeps it from being talked about, because if you talk about it, then you have to identify that he's not the person that you've put on this pedestal. So let's
Right.
not talk about him. So I love the fact that you talked about it and you talked about how vicious, how inhumane it was, but you gave these women dignity, you gave them their names, and I love you for that. So can you
Thank
just
you.
share a little bit about how that came together and how that desire to give, I don't know if that was your intention to give them dignity, but you did.
Yeah, I mean, and I would add Joyce Heth to that list. The other kind of section of it deals with Joyce Heth, who was shown around by P.T. Barnum. And so, that relationship being that these are both men, J. Marion Sims, who's called the father of gynecology, and P.T. Barnum, who's kind of the father of American popular culture, both began their careers literally on the bodies of Black women, the dissected bodies of Black women. And also, were big hams, like really were interested in their fame in a particular kind of at any cost way.
Right.
So interestingly enough, I actually started writing Feelin uh, at the same time that I was writing Patient. It's just Patient got out there, got out there quickly.
Mhm.
Um, and in many ways, Feelin was the way that I was making sense of what I was doing in Patient. So there are actually a lot of excerpts from Patient in Feelin, and some of the multimedia work that was involved in the process of thinking through Patient shows up in Feelin. So there's some actual video poems and that sort. The origins of the book is that something did happen to me personally, medically, that um, very much kind of triggered um, responses that were not, of my own history, but were what we could call a rememory of history. And
Mhm.
that is to say, all the ways that many Black folks have a adverse relationship with medicine, and it is because of this longer history, right? And that personal event in which I had an ovarian torsion, of course, was gynecological, and I knew the origins of that discipline, that medical discipline in the United States. And so I kept asking like God and my mom, like, why is this happening to me? And needed to process that. And so in doing so, I ended up like finding that inhabiting the voices of Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and Joyce were helpful in that they had answers for the memory. They had answers for the extent to which what I was thinking, experiencing, feeling was not out of pocket, was not out of the blue, was not me being irrational. There is a history there, and there is also a way of healing and moving through that history. Um, and so I was gonna make a series of watercolors
Mm,
about that experience, but I was accepted in the summer of 2007 into the Black Poetry Workshop Cave Canem, and it was there in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which was one of the last stops on P.T. Barnum and Joyce Heth's
mm,
tour before she died, that I wrote the first poem that ended up being a part of Patient. And one of them was the poem where Joyce Heth announces her death.
mm,
And I'd never written a persona poem before. Like it never occurred to me to write a poem in the voice of another person, much
mm,
less a real person in history. But the sense of doing that was so strong
mm,
that I continued to kind of it almost became a spiritual practice of like really feeling, immersing myself into what these women could possibly have been experiencing,
mm.
and really interrupting the archive of them that was totally created by their oppressors. That's how that.
Is that you did interrupt the the perception of them that was created, and you gave them that dignity of having a name and being um, essential to this history, not a part of it, essential. They, without them, all the rest of the stuff would be mute. It was their bodies that created this knowledge. And as you go back to all of this creativity is knowledge. Thank you for that, because that really touched and truly moved me. I'm recognizing something about myself. I have recognized that I'm gravitating to authors that give positive voice to historical figures, especially
Yeah.
female historical figures that have been overlooked. You find it in your heart to give power to the voices of these women. And I thank you so very much for your time coming on and sharing your work and your energy and your passion with me. Is there anything
Awesome.
that you would like to share before we close?
Um, so this is a trailer to chapter 1.
We touch death in Black studies because we must. I would like to, for a moment, say a word about the structure of the text and images in this project. This project deploys modes of code switching and cross conversation in which image, academic prose, poetry, and lyric by me and other women artists are represented as speaking to each other. We begin this foray into feeling with a Black study of grief. As a means of refusing the expository, which would, in my view, gloss over the intimacy and immediacy of feeling grief. The bulk of this chapter is a series of 14-line poems that find interspecies community with a grieving mother, Orca. In writing these poems, I was able to access my own grief from having lost not only my father that same summer, but at least 13 other loved ones since my move to the Coast Salish lands in 2016. The poems are a practice in affective schedulity, where I feel and think through the meaning of mourning through text. The content of this chapter is grief, as well as I could communicate it. I wade through grief with Black studies to do this work and also to make sense of Black terror, loss, sadness, and all of the other unnamed affective experiences that grief tends to. Even that attempt to structure grief is too clinical. In my grief, Black studies, particularly Black feminist studies, has been my companion, a wrenchingly honest friend, sometimes too honest, but always there. As these notes close, I imagine myself in a room full of these sighted thinkers. There is a point at which they all must go home, away from the din of our party, and as I close the door behind them, their words, thoughts, and feelings have not left me. But in the silence of the room in which I physically remain, I meet myself. And all of what could not be said before and after our meeting, full of life, breath, and sorrow, comes up through my belly, into my chest, my throat, and eyes. It fills me and overflows, becomes the room. This is what could be recorded.
Thank you. I'm glad you added that in. I appreciate that. And I appreciate your time and thank you so much for the work you do. And I pray that you never get weary in well doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience and for inviting me here.
Thank you for watching Read This. Remember, books are everything. They touch every area of our lives. Make sure you pick up a book today.